On March 31, 1993, at midnight on the film set, the call, lights, camera, action was heard, and Brandon Lee entered the frame, only to be shot with a blank cartridge. However, a plug got stuck in the barrel of the prop gun, and it flew out, fatally injuring the actor. These were the filming of the movie The Crow, based on the poem by Edgar Allan Poe. 144 years after the poet's death, his work still possessed a peculiar mystical power. They not only killed those involved in them but also brought them worldwide fame. And so it happened with Brandon Lee. On January 19, 1809, in a family of theatrical actors, the second son was born and named Edgar Poe. Edgar's father, David Poe, was studying law when he saw his future wife, Elizabeth, on stage. For her sake, he abandoned his studies and took to the stage himself. While Elizabeth, a born actress, understood perfectly well the life that awaited them, David did not. To make a living, the couple performed 3 shows per evening, but the earnings barely covered their expenses. Hunger and constant cold during their tours led to Elizabeth contracting tuberculosis. David, on the other hand, started drinking and eventually just ran away, leaving his wife to die with 3 young children in her arms. At that time, the youngest sister of the future poet was also born. Elizabeth's final role was in the play The Stranger, fittingly mirroring the stranger her husband turned out to be. At first glance, Edgar Allan Poe seemed to be the luckiest of the 3 orphan children. However, Edgar Poe's fatal fate lay in the fact that behind each of his successes hid tragedy, and behind every stroke of fate followed a reward. The Allan family, into which Poe entered, was wealthy. The family had co-owned a company that traded in tobacco and cotton. Poe's stepfather, John Allan, already had 2 illegitimate children when they took in Edgar. However, his stepmother, Frances Allan, had no children of her own. Essentially, Edgar was taken into the family as a sort of household pet for the wife, akin to a lapdog. As no one officially adopted him. On January 7, 1812, the day of Edgar Poe's baptism, they added the surname of his new parents, and he became Edgar Allan Poe. When Edgar was 6 years old, he was taken to Scotland. The Allans didn't stay there for long. Soon, they moved to London, where Poe began his education. He even managed to switch schools twice during his time in London. He would later describe the second one, in the suburb of Stoke Newington, in the story William Wilson.
The house, I have said, was old and irregular. The grounds were extensive, and a high and solid brick wall, topped with a bed of mortar and broken glass, encompassed the whole.
In 1819, the Allans returned to America, to Richmond, where Poe continued attending school. Aside from his interest in poetry, he was a typical boy who enjoyed boxing, swimming, and even fishing. Everything took a different turn when he fell in love for the first time. He fell in love with the mother of his classmate, Jane Stannard, when he visited their home. She strongly resembled his mother. A year after Poe first saw Jane Stannard, she passed away. Poe was simultaneously crushed by grief and affected by the tragedy. Under the impression of what had happened, he wrote,
"I could not love except where death was mingling his with beauty's breath."
With this, the second victim in his life, he gained the knowledge of a horrifying formula of poetry, which immortalized his name.
The death of a beautiful woman is, unquestionably, the most poetical topic in the world.
Doesn't this sound like the confession of a psychopath? What drove his manic passion for women, in whose pale faces he saw death? Edgar Allan Poe had another school love, 15-year-old Sarah Elmira Royster. The girl's parents were against her associating with him, let alone getting married. Therefore, they breathed a sigh of relief when, after school, Edgar Allan Poe enrolled at the University of Virginia and left Richmond. While the future famous poet was busy with his studies, Sarah Elmira Royster was quickly married off to someone else. But this love will come back into Edgar Allan Poe's life, and perhaps it is this love that will ultimately lead to his demise. By a grim twist of fate, typical for Poe, he entered the University of Virginia in 1826, the year of the death of the institution's founder, Thomas Jefferson, as if death were mocking him. Enrolling in the university opened young Edgar Allan Poe's eyes to his true position in the Allan family. The campus was characterized by loose morals, where young men constantly drank, played cards, dice, and even engaged in duels. Poe immersed himself in such a life wholeheartedly. However, what might be tolerated by the true heirs of wealthy families became a catastrophe for Poe. His pseudo-stepfather, John Allan, believed that providing money for education was already a significant favor to someone unrelated to him. As for covering the cost of vices, it was out of the question. In 1839, Edgar Poe wrote William Wilson, a story of a doppelganger haunting the protagonist. Both characters in the story were born on January 19th, the writer's birthday. Essentially, the narrative depicts Poe's experiences during his time at the university. To everyone, he is Edgar from a wealthy family, but he knows himself to be Poe without a penny to his name. Unable to resist the allure of debauchery, the story concludes with the doppelganger's murder at a carnival in Rome. Due to John Allan's refusal to cover Poe's gambling debts, Edgar is forced to drop out of the university without completing his education. Half a century after the poet's death, the Raven Society is established at the university. The society establishes a museum in room number 13, believed to be the room where Poe lived. Leaving the university, Poe found himself practically on the streets. From being the household favorite of his former foster father, he was relegated to the category of tiresome toys that could be easily discarded. His life turned upside down once again, and as compensation for the loss, his first success came. It was at this point that Edgar Poe managed to publish his initial poems, but the money was insufficient for food or shelter. At the age of 18, Poe took a desperate step. Assuming a false identity and adding 4 extra years to his age, he enlisted in the army. He served in the artillery for 2 years and even attained the rank of sergeant. During this period, he quit drinking and brought his life into order. However, fate didn't let this period of well-being go unpunished. His stepmother, Frances Allan, whom he loved as his mother, passed away, and Edgar didn't even manage to attend her funeral. Yet, thanks to this tragedy, he successfully resigned from the army. In 1830, Edgar entered the United States Military Academy at West Point. Around the same time, John Allan remarried and had legitimate children, making Edgar Poe no longer of interest to his former pseudo-stepfather. Hearing this news, Poe fell into depression, neglected his duties, and faced a court-martial. He is discharged from service by the court sentence. So, Edgar Poe was a convicted criminal, penniless, and homeless. He resided in either New York or Baltimore, earning sporadic prizes from literary contests. Eventually, he arrived at his maternal Aunt Maria Clem's place. It was there that he committed his major crime, one that he easily got away with. Upon reaching his relatives, he fell in love with his 13-year-old cousin Virginia and married her. To accomplish this, he arranged with witnesses at the wedding to conceal the true age of the bride and declare her as of legal age. Later in the short story Eleanor, Poe described a similar case. A man married his 15-year-old relative, and later she died of tuberculosis, but without the slightest twinge of conscience, he immediately married another, although he promised the dying woman not to do this. The story turned out to be prophetic. In mid-January 1842, shortly before Edgar Allan Poe's 33rd birthday, Virginia played the piano and sang, which was her beloved pastime. Suddenly, she started coughing up blood. At that moment, the poet thought that his wife simply had a ruptured blood vessel in her throat. He still didn't realize, or perhaps didn't want to admit to himself, that his wife was destined for the same fate as his mother. 5 years after Edgar Allan Poe wrote the story Eleanor, Virginia did indeed die from tuberculosis. Certainly, Virginia's death was not a gruesome crime, as in the murders in the Rue Morgue. However, in many ways, it was Edgar Allan Poe's internal beast that killed her. Edgar Allan Poe's life was divided into short periods of enlightenment and binges. While in the former, there was no one more gracious and charming, in the latter, he turned into a true beast. He squandered his last pennies, lost jobs, and quarreled with the few friends he had. As a result, the family constantly went hungry, moving from one city to another, from one cold house to another. And Virginia's condition worsened and worsened. There was practically no endeavor that Edgar Allan Poe did not fail due to alcohol. After securing the release of his literary magazine, The Stylus, he went to Washington to interview U.S. President John Tyler but ended up in a binge instead of conducting the interview. In 1843, Edgar Allan Poe himself became a character in Thomas Dunn English's book Walter Wolfe, or The Doom of the Drinker. The flip side of his drinking was his pathological lying. He lied constantly to everyone, creditors, friends, and family. He effortlessly fabricated facts about his own life. In his autobiography for the Sunday Museum magazine, he claimed that, like Byron, he went to fight for Greece in his youth and returned to the USA via Russia. Lying became so ingrained in him that, while working as a journalist, instead of seeking out news, he began simply inventing them. In 1844, he published a sensational article in the New York Sun, detailing a transatlantic balloon flight. It was a brilliant report with numerous technical details. The publication caused a huge sensation in New York. The city was abuzz with talk of this astonishing news, and people stormed the newspaper office to learn more. As a result, Poe's reputation as a journalist was practically destroyed after the exposure. Nevertheless, this publication became a classic in science fiction and inspired Jules Verne's novel, 5 Weeks in a Balloon. Opportunities for Edgar Allan Poe to earn a living were dwindling, but everything changed when he wrote his true masterpiece. On January 29, 1845, The Raven was published.
Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempter sent or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me truly, I implore. Is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the Raven nevermore.
Initially, Poe wanted to use an owl instead of a raven in his most famous poem but ultimately opted for the raven. In mythology, the raven is not just a symbol of wisdom like the owl. It serves as a mediator between the world of the dead and the world of the living. In Norse mythology, the supreme god Odin, associated with Valhalla, the realm of fallen warriors, is accompanied by 2 wise ravens, Hugin and Munin. The name Hugin means thought, and Munin means memory. In ancient Greece, the raven possesses the ability to see the hidden, associating it with Apollo and Athena. Hence, in Poe's famous poem, the raven perches on the bust of Athena Pallas. In the Old Testament, Noah sends out 2 birds from the ark, a raven and a dove. The raven serves as a harbinger of bad news, while the dove represents the good. In the medieval period, the raven became the embodiment of the forces of hell and the devil, while the dove symbolizes heaven and the Holy Spirit. The publication of The Raven turned Edgar Allan Poe into a true star. He gained additional income through public lectures. Even enamored female fans, who gazed at Poe with adoring eyes in literary salons, wrote him poems and letters. Edgar Allan Poe basked in the rays of fame. It was during this period that he grew his famous mustache, which is now commonly associated with him. At the same time, he became a co-owner of a literary magazine, fulfilling a dream he had harbored for many years. Meanwhile, Edgar Allan Poe's situation increasingly resembled the plot of his story, Eleonora, in which the protagonist, married to a 15-year-old, finds another when his wife dies of tuberculosis. Virginia Poe was already very weak from the illness when her world-famous husband started an affair with Frances Osgood. Edgar Poe's poem Valentine has survived, in which, if you take the letter from each line corresponding to the line number, the name Frances Sargent Osgood is formed. Just like in the story Eleanora, the wife had no objection to her husband's new acquaintance, and they even became friends because, for Frances, the poet temporarily quit drinking. But soon the idyll came to an end. Poetess Elizabeth Elliot, also in correspondence with Edgar Allan Poe, accidentally saw Virginia and Frances laughing at a letter outside the poet's home. From snippets of their conversation, she understood it was about her letter. She not only demanded her correspondence back but also spread rumors that Frances' last child was not her husband's but Edgar Allan Poe's. The scandal instantly ruined Poe's reputation. He was denied entry to all literary salons, and all public lectures were cancelled. Edgar Allan Poe found himself without money again, his magazine failed, and he resumed drinking. As for Frances Osgood, she also contracted tuberculosis and died a year after Edgar Allan Poe. However, much earlier, on January 30, 1847, Virginia Poe passed away. Nevertheless, while she was still alive, Edgar Allan Poe had already started looking for a new wife. He was in constant turmoil, attempting to build relationships with one admirer of his talent after another. All the while, he was desperately drinking. In the end, he embarked on 2 simultaneous romances, with the self-proclaimed prophetess of Providence, Sarah Helen Whitman, and with the writer Annie Richmond. The situation at times resembled a true split in personality. He signed his letters to Whitman as Edgar wrote to her that he dreamed of escaping with her into the silence of the grave, and took her on dates to the cemetery. On the other hand, he signed his letters to Richmond as Eddie arrived at her always meticulously and neatly dressed, and promised never to drink again. A year later, he arranged a secret wedding with Sarah Helen Whitman, but she simply didn't show up. Annie Richmond learned about it and broke off her relationship with him. In 1849, he traveled to Richmond, where he proposed to Sarah Elmira Royster, the same woman with whom they had been in love as children. And this proposal of marriage was the last in his life. He traveled to New York and Philadelphia on business, with a layover in Baltimore, where he met his death. What happened in Baltimore is a mystery. Edgar Allan Poe was found dying in a tavern, wearing someone else's clothes. According to one version, he became a victim of the relatives of Sarah Elmira Royster, who were against the marriage to a man with a horrifying reputation widely discussed in newspapers across the country. According to another version, he fell prey to political machinations prevalent at the time. Perhaps, he was intoxicated to unconsciousness and taken to vote multiple times at one polling place, being dressed in different clothing each time. Another possibility is illness, such as epilepsy or liver cirrhosis. And, of course, the possibility of fatal alcohol poisoning. During Edgar Allan Poe's funeral, there was heavy rain. He was buried very quickly, with only a couple of relatives present, and the officiating priest was the uncle of his deceased wife. The poet was laid to rest in a distant corner of the cemetery, next to his grandfather's grave, in a cheap coffin without handles, an engraved plaque, covering, or pillows under his head. 25 years later, he was reburied, but by that time, there was no certainty about which exact grave belonged to Edgar Allan Poe, and it's not ruled out that someone else lies beneath the modern memorial.